This is the Meetinghouse with Dwight A. Moody. News, reviews, commentary, and conversation on religion and American life. Now, here is Dr. Moody.
And good morning to all of you. Good afternoon to all of you. We're coming to you from Greenville, South Carolina today in our studio there. I welcome you to the Meetinghouse and to our conversation on religion and American life. I have 4 news stories today, 1 commentary about things that have happened in Georgia, and a conversation with Dr. Paul Djupe on the subject of Christian nationalism and what I call the Christian Crusade to save the United States. Dr. Djupe is Associate Professor of Political Science at Denison University in Ohio, a school very much like my own Georgetown College in central Kentucky. We're coming to you, of course, as always, on radio and YouTube and streaming live at the Facebook page of the meetinghouse.net and also St. Stephen's Church, and also on my Facebook page. You can share it to your Facebook page. You may have friends who might want to learn more about our conversation on religion and American life. As always, we begin our program with our news stories, and I have 4 stories today. Beginning out of Tucson, Arizona, actually out of Phoenix, Arizona. Phoenix is the next stop on the Reawaken America tour, something we're going to talk about a little bit later in the program, featuring Oklahoma businessman Clay Clark and retired U.S. Army General Mike Flynn. Both embraced the tour, which began last April as a one-time only event in Tulsa, Oklahoma, but it has continued monthly with an average attendance of about 3,000. The purpose of these rallies is, and I quote, to kill the spirit of fear, expose the truth about medical fraud, expose election fraud and the great global reset while promoting Jesus is king and not done with America yet, end quote. Planners and attendees connect these developments to a 2007 prophecy, as they call it, by South African-born Pentecostal minister Kim Clement. The cost to attend any of these rallies is $250, but those unable to pay can simply pay what they can and get a ticket. Now from Tucson, Arizona. On New Year's Day, 43 congregations of the Reformed Church in America, RCA, split from their national denomination to create a new denomination, the Alliance of Reformed Churches. The RCA itself is one of the oldest Protestant bodies in the United States, almost 400 years old, but it's fallen on hard times with less than 200,000 members in about 1,000 congregations. At least 125 churches from various denominations are in conversation with ARC leaders about joining. The action follows upon the annual meeting of the RCA in Tucson, during which guidelines were adopted to allow departing congregations to keep their property and their assets. The division comes in part, and who is surprised at this, over theological differences regarding LGBTQ membership and ordination and clergy. And now in Columbia, Missouri, the headquarters of Religion News Service out there at the University of Missouri. Throughout the year, Religion News Service distributes stories on a wide range of religion activity and ideas. I read it regularly. At the end of the year 2021, they identified 10 young people of influence in religion in America. Only 1 is a clergy person. None are preachers. 1 is still a student in divinity school. But all are social, political, and economic activists of one kind or another. A Buddhist social worker, a Christian scholar and podcaster, a Muslim educator, a Pentecostal athlete, Jewish, Catholic, and Muslim social activists and organizers, a Christian singer-songwriter, a Hindu Ivy League University chaplain. A very diverse group. Their average age is less than 40 years old. And you can read all about them at religionnews.com. Finally, we go to Denver, Colorado. The Potter's House of Denver, Colorado is an offshoot of the famous Church of T.D. Jakes in Dallas, Texas. It has decided to sell its property in Arapahoe County and continue to worship exclusively online. The church, led by the daughter and son-in-law of Jakes, is one of the first and most prominent megachurches to move one of its locations entirely online without operating other in-person campuses in the area. Quote, COVID-19 forced every church in America to rethink how to best serve their parishioners and the broader community. One of the pastors said, due to the inability to gather and the economic instability of the pandemic, our church, like many other churches in the nation, experienced declining donations, end quote. The church decided to abandon its 32-acre property and 130,000 square foot building, first built in 1989, and the church's home since 1911. Another pastor at the Denver campus said the church had averaged 10,000 worshipers in live attendance and another 300,000 on YouTube live streaming. Quote, we decided that the best way forward would be to sell the property, continue our online offering that had proven so successful, and maintain our hands-on community outreach operations. That's from Denver. That's the news today from the Meetinghouse. I'll be back in just a minute, Dr. Djupe, and we're going to talk about the role of religion in the January 6th insurrection, the pushback against the federal government, how that's rooted in religious convictions. It's part of my new series entitled The Christian Crusade to Control America. I'll be back in just a minute. Hello, everyone, and you are in the Meetinghouse with me, Dwight A. Moody, the founder and host of this weekly newsletter and weekly broadcast. You can sign up and subscribe to the weekly newsletter. It comes out on Wednesday evening. You can go to our website at themeetinghouse.net and subscribe. You can read scores of commentaries there and listen to the podcast. This program itself will be a podcast within 24 hours. There's many books to review, and you can send me a message if there's something you think I have misstated, or a program you think I should pursue, or a person that I should recruit to be on the program. We're delighted to have from Northern Ohio, Dr. Paul Djupe today, Associate Professor of Political Science at Denison University. Paul, welcome to the Meetinghouse.
Thanks so much, Dwight, for having me. It's a real pleasure. Twitter is really an amazing thing for connecting us to have conversations we wouldn't otherwise have.
No doubt about it, but I wouldn't have had this conversation with you had you not published your article this week about, and this fascinated me no end, about the religious roots or the religious component of the insurrection last year. And you connected with what you call Christian nationalism, or what is widely known as Christian nationalism. And that's where I want to start. What do we mean by this phrase, Christian nationalism?
Right. Well, it means a lot of things to a lot of people.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of diversity here in what Christian nationalism can mean, but at least the way it's become known, I think, and the way that it's been active in politics over the last, especially 5 years, but extending way back, at its core, is this notion that the United States is a Christian nation. Now, that may not be surprising because still there's a majority of Christians in the United States. So this isn't about just the numbers, and it's not about, say, the inspiration for the Constitution or the creation of the United States. This is really more about the role of the federal government, the government in promoting Christianity. So for Christian nationalists, um, they really believe that believe a lot of things, but one of those is that the United States has a special role to play in promoting
Mhm.
Christianity. That is, it has historical roots in
Right.
Christianity. Christians founded it, and the United States should continue to act in the benefit, be an advocate for and a representative for Christianity. In some ways, thinking that the United States or a government should act in according to your values is not a surprising thing. I think all of us believe that, regardless of what our values are, what they are. But the key here, I think, is this exclusive notion that the government should be acting particularly for Christians, and draw some lines that about, say, extending rights to other groups that may not be Christian or not follow Christian teaching. And that's the real problem. So Christian nationalism is really about this conflation of religion and the state.
Another element to this, the recent surge of interest and activity is the conviction that the country is losing its Christian identity, its Christian values, its Christian moorings. I quoted a couple of weeks ago in one of my news stories, one of the U.S. House of Representatives from Colorado, who put it like this, and I'm going to paraphrase it. She said, "I'm tired of our country being run by ungodly people. It's time for us, me and you, to take it back."
Yep.
I think this is a slightly secularized version of this vision that the country has gone to hell, so to speak, and it's time for us to resurrect it before it's too late.
No, I think that's exactly right. And that phrase, taking back the United
Mhm.
States, right, is a very common one. And
Very
it's
common.
been, yeah, it's been around for a really long time. Whenever there's a new movement that comes up, there's a new social problem. There's this tendency to say, well, it's because the United States has strayed from its roots.
Right.
And some are willing to attach that to a religious movement. So we need to re-Christianize. We need to take back. We need to be more involved. But, it's taken on, I think, a much more aggressive
Mm-hmm.
kind of tone. And Lauren Boebert, who I think is who you're talking about from Colorado, is a
Right.
good
Right.
example of that. Especially when she attaches these kinds of notions to her promotions of gun rights, and that sort of thing. So it's a really aggressive kind of form of we need to take this back by force if necessary. And of course,
Yeah.
that's what connects us up with the insurrection eventually.
Yes, I think 50 years ago, when I was in college and in my ministerial training, this idea of winning back America was largely a movement to convert individual people, to promote piety rather than politics. And the difference today, as you allude to, is the overtly political nature of the movement now. And as a matter of fact, I think Donald Trump Jr. famously said just a week or two ago in a speech, or maybe this was a recording of a speech somewhere else, that the spiritual approach to it of conversion and appeal has not worked. It's time for us to get much more aggressive, much more political, no holds barred, quit turning the other cheek, he famously said.
Yep.
And this is what I think is, as you have described it, brought it brought it to the fore. Who would you say are the national leaders of this movement?
Yeah, that's such a great question. We've really come a long way from a Billy Sunday or Billy Graham, right? Who really had these sort of individual. We're going to reach out. We're going to re-Christianize America,
Or
and that
Dwight
is
A.
what's
Moody?
absolutely right. Absolutely right. And that's the force that's going to bring rightness and goodness in
Right.
this country. So yeah, it's much more aggressive now. But the leadership of it's hard to even call this a movement, because think about the civil rights movement, for instance. It's easy to point to a leader like um, uh, Martin Luther King, and it's easy to point to organizations that they were a part of, the NAACP or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. With Christian nationalism, there really aren't those kinds of umbrella organizations. Although there are ones that you would probably say are involved, or at least co-conspirators is perhaps too strong of a word, but they're definitely involved. So we can think about organizations with Christian right, like the Family Research Council, would be a good example. But think of how diverse it's become, and
Yes.
just like the news events that you were reading before. Who is Clay Clark?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, who would have thought that the pillow guy, Mike
Yes.
Lindell, would be a national leader promoting Christian nationalism and
Yeah.
other sorts of associated.
I want to ask you about the Pentecostal charismatic movement. I try to follow this pretty closely, and as a matter of fact, I think this Reawaken America tour is rooted in Pentecostal culture. I don't know whether this Clay Clark or even Mike Flynn, either one of them would be charismatic, but I follow the events and the articles on charisma.com, the headquarters down in Orlando, Florida. And it seems to me that a good bit of this Christian nationalism is coming out of the Pentecostal community. Am I right about this, or?
Well, I think it certainly has a stronger anchor there, and there has been in the past a little bit more hesitance from other sides of the sort of broader evangelical movement,
Right.
Following this. I mean, you think of the longstanding hesitance of Baptists to be associated with the state, right? But of course, that collapsed in the 1980s. So, I think it's pretty common in evangelicalism and even beyond to find people who would associate themselves with the ideas of Christian nationalism. But I think you're right to point to the special role that some Pentecostals and sort of a little bit more broadly the prosperity gospel movement, in part because I think they're way more open to theological innovation, right? And I think the other part of this is they tend to be non-denominational, right? And that just allows them a lot more freedom, to innovate theologically or to think about the grounds on which they would grow their enterprise. In these days, I mean, adding a political component is certainly a way to do that for some, not for all, but definitely for some.
Are you familiar with what's known as network Christianity?
At least I read a great book about it a year ago. So, yeah, this is a prophetic movement, right?
Yes,
apostolic faith.
And outside, as you say, of denominational structures, not really led by nationally known religious leaders, operating on the fringe or kind of beneath the radar, but
at least for some. For others, I mean, they're very widely known and deeply connected, right? And also in some ways very hierarchical, which is interesting. But
I have reported ever since I got interested in and aware of the role of these prophecies, some of them related to the election of Trump in 2016, and some of them predicting his reelection in 2020, which I think is at the root of this big lie movement that all of these Pentecostal prophets, as they call them, predicted he was going to win. And then when he didn't, there had to be some explanation for God's prophecies not coming true. And this is at least the religious roots of the big lie, so to speak.
I think that's a great connection to make, and one that we've found. We've found that there is a connection between believing in prophecy and believing the big lie, and believing, a wide variety of conspiracy theories. Actually, it allows the belief that there's that supernatural forces are governing, that God is involved, and demonic forces are involved. Allows for this kind of understanding. I mean, everything, right, is the result of forces of good or evil.
Well,
That constant battle.
Of course, I'm sure you have read and devoured the Left Behind series. You probably even taught a course on it up there in Denison College, Denison University. But when you have rhetoric and narratives like this that are so dominate the white evangelical culture, it is fertile ground for exactly the kind of thing you are talking about.
It's as if you've been writing my journal articles, because this is exactly the way that we talk about this. Is that there really is this orientation to thinking if evil is active and involved in the world, then you're open to kind of these new messages that would suggest, hey, there's something that's working against you and against your values. It must be demonic, right? And then in the past, sort of a historical kind of funny thing about American politics is that, it used to be fairly diverse. So you could find conservatives among Democrats, and you could find liberals among Republicans. But especially since the 1960s, those two have polarized. And so we have liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans. And it tends to be that we find evangelicals in the Republican camp. So with that orientation that evil is active in the world, and now, issue entrepreneurs who are saying, there are demonic forces at work that are pushing for the president's impeachment, which that's a direct quote, right?
Yes.
Then that you understand how we get to a place where there's going to be some extreme behavior. So we start to understand where the insurrection could potentially come from. But you're exactly right to point to that.
And I'm very curious. I read Robert Jones' article the day after the insurrection last year, and I went back and reread it this week, drawing attention to all the religious signage, the religious rhetoric, Bibles and flags and prayers and all of this. So let's unpack that a little bit. The religious motivation was not the only constituency in that movement, but it was a significant one, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And, we don't have great data on exactly who showed up. And, we weren't able to survey these folks and ask them all the questions that we'd want to ask them. But you're right that the symbols and the behavior of the insurrectionists just tells the story itself. We see the Proud Boys praying together on Pennsylvania Avenue. Of course, there was the famous prayer in the well of the Senate. That I have just a little quote from, if I can get to my notes here, where they thank God for filling this chamber with patriots that love you and that love Christ, allowing them to send a message to their enemies that this is our nation and not theirs. So prayer itself isn't a sign of Christian nationalism. And it can do all sorts of things. But when it's combined with this particular content that thanks God for delivering us Congress and taking it away from them, that's where we see this kind of exclusive notion. So, yeah, I mean, seeing those sorts of behaviors, seeing the symbols, seeing the flags, that's exactly right. That tells us that, Christian, as Tom Etzel put it in the New York Times, the insurrection was as Christian nationalist as it gets.
Yeah, I agree with this. What do you think is coming next?
Oh my. Well, yeah, I could say that some of these are my 3 a.m. nightmares.
I hear you. I hear you. Yeah.
In some ways, we're just not sure. One of the things that I think we hoped, and this this played out in QAnon. We haven't talked about QAnon, but it's wrapped up in this too. As you know, this broader conspiracy that the Democratic Party and its leaders are evil and running a child trafficking ring out of pizza joints and that sort of thing. Anyway, we hoped that that for the good of the country, that QAnon was going to fade after Donald Trump and after Q had stopped posting on in various places, and we've started to get a little bit of evidence that that's true. But when we look at, say, support for the insurrectionists or other sorts of attitudes and behaviors that look pretty extreme, they've actually intensified a little bit. So they're not going away. It's not fading after Trump lost his social media platforms, and in fact, it's intensified. So we're looking for the next event, right? And I think it takes some kind of institutional event, like an election, perhaps to bring out these folks again. So it's entirely possible that there could be more protests at State House. I mean, especially depending on how the election goes. The trick here is the president's party tends to lose seats in midterm elections.
Right.
So it's very likely to go in a Republican kind of favorable way.
No, I think everybody's expecting that, not because of this religious movement, but just because that's, as you say,
that's
the
just a normal
pattern,
thing.
normal thing. Always, Democrats and Republicans, they party out of the White House picks up seats in this election.
Yeah, I think that's right. So, but what happens in 2024? And the problem, I think the problem here is that democratic norms, so just respect for process and for equal rights, seem like they've eroded incredibly over the last 5 years. And so, people like me who think about this, who think about the continuance of institutions and the support of the rule of law. I mean, it's obviously not, I'm not the only one that thinks about this, but lots are, and we're really concerned that this really has eroded. So not just, are Democrats safe in power, but what happens in this next election, and what happens when a new sort of super polarized extreme Republican Party takes power? Are they going to try to take away the rights of groups they don't like and try to enshrine themselves in power? It's a well-worn path across the world of countries losing their democracy.
The role of religion in all of this, I think, is this. The religious aims justify trampling upon political norms. That is, if you really think that God is doing something or wants to do something, or if you think this is a battle of good versus evil and not just the form of government that you have or the economic system you have, then this conviction that God wants you to do this justifies, as you call it, eroding political norms and democratic norms, and without bothering their conscience about it, or without being disturbed about it, because there is a higher good. There's a stronger end game than just democracy.
There's another part of the internet where I coined a phrase that I still quite like, and I said that conservative Christians have begun to follow the inverted golden rule, which is do unto others what you expect them to do unto you.
Very interesting.
Yeah,
the inverted golden rule.
So rather than set an example for how other people should act, it's really sort of, I better do it to them because they're about to do it to us. And so think about that, how that plays into fits the big lie, right? Here's a group that's being called a demonic force, where you're told that they are going to ban the Bible, or that Joe Biden is somehow going to hurt God, which is what Donald Trump said at a rally. So if they're demonic and evil, and they're about to cheat on a massive scale to take power and to oppress you, of course you're going to try to do something active to combat that, stop that from happening.
Now,
that's where we are.
Yes, it is. And of course, we have these anecdotes. We've quoted some here already. But as a social scientist like you are, trained in gathering of data. Talk to us a little bit about how you gather your information. Your article quoted statistics about what percentage of Christian nationalists were still supporting the insurrection. How do you gather this data to make a statement like that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is one thing that, of course, I find very, very interesting to do. And it's in some ways the most important part of my job, so I can make statements like this and feel
Right.
confident. There's lots of ways to do this, but I tend to turn to surveys. These will go out and get individuals that will match census proportions of what the United States looks like. So we make sure that we have 38% of people are from the South, and about 12% are African Americans, and all the rest. So we make sure that we have a group of people that looks like the United States. And then we have to think, of course, really carefully about how to ask these questions that are unbiased, but also follow in the kind of language that they would use and recognize. And so, for instance, this is a little bit different than the insurrection, but about these arguments about forthcoming Christian persecution, that like the Democrats are going to ban the Bible. We
Right.
look really carefully for leaders making these statements explicitly out in public. And then we ask people, have you heard somebody making this statement, and do you believe it? And so we found that a growing number across the last several years have come to believe that Democrats are going to ban the Bible if they gain control. Right. And we're able to say that confidently because it was a real thing. We know that people are saying it. And then we asked in our survey that looks like the United States, and asked them if they've heard it and if they believe it. So we're really careful to try to use natural language to capture the kinds of things that they're thinking and hearing, so that we can report these sorts of things. So we did that with a connection to the insurrection, and definitely to Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism, there's lots of ways to capture it. We've relied on a series of items that have been used for about 12 years now. There's been books and lots of articles written about it, studies about whether it's a valid indicator of this broader worldview. And so we rely on those items to capture Christian nationalism.
You have used in your explanation there the plural pronoun we. Who is the we? Are you personally involved in helping to shape these surveys and questions? And who is it that actually performs this research? That is, ask the questions.
Yep. So I say we because it really is a community effort in some ways. We have conversations across time and across journal articles and books, where we discuss these measures and whether they are good measures for the kinds of things we should capture. There's value, I think, in using measures that other people have come up with and that the sort of broader community agrees on, because then we can compare the levels and how they're changing across time. So one of the findings that we're going to try to deal with as we gather more data is whether Christian nationalism is increasing or decreasing.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, there's a debate about that. There's a little bit of evidence that says decreasing, and there's some evidence that says it might be increasing or staying the same. But I've been writing these surveys. I write them. I work with a variety of different people. One of them is Ryan Burge.
Who's we know Ryan Burge.
Yeah, he's been on this show, right?
Yeah, he's been in. I reviewed his book, The Nuns, and as you know, like me, he is a Baptist pastor, and so we share a lot of history and a lot of convictions together. And yeah, he's been on the show at least once or twice. Yeah,
sure. And so I draw from the work of Ryan's great guy and great scholar.
Yes.
I draw on the work and work with Robbie Jones. I'm on the board of PRRI, so I work with them. But there's a wide variety of others that we draw inspiration from and work with. I in particular wrote the survey that I drew I did the research for, and then I did the statistics and that sort of thing. But I'm always willing to share that information with people who want to see it, because we try to be as open and transparent as possible. That's part of what doing social science is about. So I'm trying to rely on data here and not any biases that I may have.
Do you get any interest from national political leaders of either the Republican or the Democratic sort in the kind of research you're doing?
That's interesting. I am trying to remember. I don't think that we've had politicians work with us, in part because there's so many that they work with and are playing with these sort of
Right.
notions. And frankly, that connection that I would have to a politician might taint the kind of research that I do. So I would try to keep those associations at arm's length. Now they may find the relationships that we come up with interesting, but I certainly haven't worked for a Democrat or a Republican.
Yeah.
I try not to shape their messages or do that sort of thing. I just try to report the facts, so to speak.
Well, we're talking about two different kinds of evidence. We're talking about statistics and data on one side, and we're talking about quotes and events and people on the other side. I wonder, have you ever attended an event that you thought was representative of Christian nationalism? You're up there in northern Ohio. I'm sure there's some within a driving distance of you.
Yeah, plenty. I have not, but I have lots of colleagues and some who do more of that kind of research where there's sort of participant observation. And I've read their work and seen that in action. But this is the place where I think having those relationships and also paying attention to the media and the reporting that someone like you do, is I try to keep a tight connection between these kinds of observations of what's happening on the ground. And then I try to use surveys to give us a sense of, well, what's the distribution of this across the United States? How prevalent is this? Are these quotes that seem really powerful, are they actually having an effect? Are they reaching people?
Yeah.
So I really like that conversation, that connection between these, between news coverage or participant observation, and then a sense of trying to see how dispersed it actually is, how common it actually is.
You see, as the host of a show, I would love to get an articulate advocate of what we're calling Christian nationalism on the show with me to talk about it. And I wonder if you had to pick out somebody that would be a good guest on this show, or to be interviewed by any journalist, or even to speak on your campus, to come in and talk to your students. Well, this is what we believe, and this is, you call it Christian nationalism, but we have other names for it. Who would these people be?
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's so diverse that it's like in some ways it's hard to say this is the right person to pick. But if I had to pick one, I would pick Bob Jeffress, some pastor of First Baptist in Dallas. I think is a tremendous figure to represent this kind of viewpoint. But there's a lot of variety here. So there's some that are just sort of, I think, scared about demographic and other change in the United States and the decline of Christianity. And there's those on the complete opposite side that are sort of what are called Seven Mountain Dominionists, who are really looking to establish a theocratic state. But I think Jeffress kind of is a nice midpoint there, and deeply involved in especially Republican efforts to push this kind of worldview.
Of course, he did come out pretty quick and condemn the insurrection. Now, I don't know whether, like Ted Cruz, he's backed off of that.
They all have. That was. It's been pretty rapid and documented, right? There was an initial kind of negative reaction to it, but I think that's all gone.
Yeah, makes you wonder whether Jeffries himself, whom you're right, I would like to talk to. I've never met him. My roots are in Southern Baptist life, and so I know who these people are.
Yeah.
So what is the one book that an interested person might want to read on this subject?
Well, I'll give you two. One is by sociologists Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry, Taking Back America for God.
Yes.
It's a tremendous study, lots of data, but also lots of good storytelling. about what's been going on over the last 20 years or so. So that's a tremendous book. And then from a non-academic side, Catherine Stewart has written The Power Worshippers. And it's a little bit more focused on the traditional Christian right. But of course, that's where Christian right is sort of centrally in Christian nationalism promotion. So those two, I think, are great snapshots of the broader movement.
Yes, I saw you reference those. I think it was you in an article that I read this week. And I wrote them down. I have not read either book, but I will pick out one of them or both and read them, because I'm doing this whole series because I have a sense that this Christian nationalism is a very powerful and influential Christian movement. And I even said on air a couple of weeks ago that I think it's the most important religious movement in America right now. Am I overstating the case here?
I don't think so. Frankly, the one thing that I kind of wonder about, and this is something that you may be particularly interested in, is the degree to which it's religious in a traditional sense.
Right.
So we know that this is suffusing religious believers, that they buy these notions, but to what degree is it actually communicated in churches? To what degree are Christian clergy promoting these kinds of views?
Mm-hmm.
My sense is that they're a little hesitant to, that they feel a little uncomfortable with that, tight connection with the United States and straying so far from traditional theological notions. But we haven't been able to document that yet. So I do think it's the most important religious movement. I think in some ways it's sweeping through churches despite what their clergy may want to have happen there. And that's an interesting sort of sub question about what's going on.
I do agree with you on this. There is such a resistance in most congregations to overt political rhetoric on the part of their ministers, certainly as part of their worship services. That's been eroded some, not only from the right of Jerry Falwell, but also from the left with Martin Luther King, both of whom, of course, used religious rhetoric to motivate their people toward a particular vision of American public life.
Yeah.
I will say this: in my preparation for this program today, I came across several significant references to a multi-campus church known as His Church. There are two branches in Texas, one branch in Kentucky, and two branches in Kentucky, including Owensboro, Kentucky, where I was a pastor for a number of years. So I immediately sent out a kind of a crowdsourcing appeal. Who knows somebody in one of these churches? The Owensboro pastor was evidently in the middle of some big drama related to the insurrection and its aftermath. So I am going to follow up on this. He may be willing to talk to me on air about all of this. But I did listen to a couple of his videos. Does that name ring a bell? His Church?
It does not. So I look forward to if you can land him. I'll tune in. That sounds great.
His name is Greg, and I've forgotten his last name. But yes, I'm very interested. I certainly appreciate your research into this, and you and Ryan and other people. I think I told you privately, and I'm going to announce that my guest next week is Robert P. Jones, who's also been a central scholar and advocate and writer, best-selling writer. I'll have to say his book, Quite Too Long, was just so powerful in the lives of so many people I know. Of course, bringing up the racial dimension of it, and we haven't even talked about that today, the role of race.
So much to talk about.
So much to talk about it.
And I would say that his book, The End of White Christian America, I think perfectly frames the dynamics that we've talked about today. So that came out a couple of years ago.
Yes, I did read it and review it, and that's what really set my mind in this direction. He was my guest about a year and a half ago, and is coming back next week. Of course, I'm interested in what he thinks about now the post-insurrection landscape, or the pre-election landscape coming up this fall. I am, of course, a resident of Georgia. My studio of origin is in Brunswick, Georgia. So in fact, is my column today. The commentary that I'm going to read in just a few minutes is about Georgia on my mind, about all the things that have played out in Georgia. Of course, there's always a racial dynamic to things in Georgia, maybe everywhere. But his book does do that, The End of White Christian America. And I think you and I need to clarify that most of this Christian nationalism is white Christian America. Am I not right about this?
And we think that that's true. Although some of the signs that we're finding now is maybe there's not as much difference among committed Christian nationalists as we thought. There are plenty of minorities that take the same position on the kind of questions that we ask in our surveys. And we're starting to play out what the implications are for politics. Largely, I think you're right. It is white, but not all of it.
Well, I want you to know that I am so interested in your research and your writing and your teaching, helping to shed light on this, what we both think is the most important religious movement going on in America right now. God's blessings on you up there at Denison University. Paul, thanks for being in the Meetinghouse today. Happy New Year. And are you all in-person classes at Denison?
In-person starting Monday.
Starting Monday.
Yep. Thanks so much for having me on. It was a real pleasure.
Great. We'll do it again real soon.
Great.
Thanks. This is Dwight Moody in the Meetinghouse. I'll be back in just a minute with my commentary, Georgia on My Mind. President Joe Biden went down to Georgia this week, and I don't blame him one little bit. Great things have been happening in the Peach State, and he wants to be a part of it. 1 year ago, you remember, 2 Democratic senators, including a Black Baptist preacher from Atlanta, were sworn in as U.S. senators from Georgia. My, what a watershed moment that was, breaking the stranglehold that powerful white men have had on the state for, I think we'd have to say, centuries. Biden, of course, carried the state of Georgia as well on his way to winning the presidency. But that was 2019, and I'm just focused on the last 12 months. Which brings me to the state legislature. They did 2 things of significance, even while controlled by Republicans. Some of you remember that I interviewed a state senator about a year ago about all of this. They repealed the slavery era law that allowed for citizens' arrest, and they adopted a hate crimes law. Both of these changes to the state criminal code were pushed in the aftermath of the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. The 3 now convicted men appealed to this old law, citizens' arrest, to justify their lynching of the young man running through their neighborhood. Their appeal failed in court, but it contributed to the drive to delete the law from the Georgia books. Ahmaud Arbery was a Black man, and he was targeted for chasing because he was Black. So contends the federal indictment against them, a move necessary because the state of Georgia at that time had no hate crime bill. But that omission has also been addressed by the Republican-led legislature. Those same lawmakers, however, saw fit to put in place restrictions to voting that will impact primarily those who vote Democratic. The use of ballot boxes and mail-in ballots, the number of days open to voting, and the freedom of third parties to provide food and water to those standing in line to vote. I'll have to say, as a Georgia voter, mail-in balloting is great. It was the first time I had ever done it in 2020. But these new unnecessary regulations designed to limit voting by specific demographics is the very reason the President of the United States came down to Georgia to promote a new voting bill now being considered in Congress. They were also the reason Major League Baseball moved the 2021 All-Star Game from Atlanta, but I'll have to tell you this, not all the power brokers of politics and sports could prevent the Atlanta Braves from hosting the World Series and winning the World Series, their first since 1995. Shortly after that great achievement in the state of Georgia, the three men local to Brunswick went on trial for what they did to Ahmaud Arbery. Some of you remember that I broadcasted from the steps of the courthouse. It took 6 weeks, but in November, all three men were convicted of murder and other multiple crimes. This was a major achievement of the criminal justice system of the state of Georgia, and largely the work of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, a prosecution team from Atlanta, and a judge from Savannah. Hopefully, it signals a new day of fairness, equity, and justice, not just in Georgia, not just in the American South, but all across the country. Finally, during one weekend in January of 2022, two momentous things occurred. Last Friday, those three white men in Brunswick were sentenced to life in prison. The judge said the most important words, quote, "The death of Ahmaud Arbery should force us to expand our definition of what a neighbor is and how we treat them." I think he was paraphrasing Jesus there, don't you? Perhaps that will happen. I don't know. But very little during the trial convinced anyone that these three white men felt any remorse, spoke any regret, or practiced any repentance. 3 days later, the football team at the University of Georgia beat their arch rival Alabama to win their first national NCAA championship since 1981, when Vince Dooley was coaching and Herschel Walker was running. I watched that ball game from start to finish. This double exclamation at the end of 12 months of drama is worth noting, even as the president did. And then he said this, quote, "Will we choose democracy over autocracy? Light over shadow? Justice over injustice?" End quote. That's the president asking those questions. I'd say it's a good year to be optimistic. While the fate of the voting rights bill is yet uncertain, it is clear that for 12 months, the people of Georgia have chosen fairness in the courtroom, progress on the criminal code, and hard work on the athletic fields. One final note, Georgia still has a long way to go on the basketball court. Last Saturday, Kentucky defeated Georgia 92-77. That's as it should be. Georgia shouldn't win everything. I'm Dwight Moody in the Meetinghouse. I'll be back in just a minute. You are in the Meetinghouse, where we have conversation on religion and American life and commentary and the news. I'm your host, Dwight A. Moody. Thank you for joining us today. I encourage you to go to our website at themeetinghouse.net. Send me a message. Maybe you know some people who are involved in this Christian nationalism, somebody that would make a good advocate of their perspective. Perhaps you could help me recruit somebody to be in the meeting house with me to talk about this. I'm very curious about it. I hope you are as well. It's a very serious matter, as the insurrection showed and as some of the data that we've talked about today demonstrates. You may have other ideas and other suggestions for the meeting house, and you can write me through the website. My email is dwightamoody@gmail.com. You can do it that way as well. You can respond to this live streaming on the Facebook page and simply put a note in the comment section. We're always delighted to know who's listening and where you are, what you think. I'm always glad to listen to a counterpoint or a correction, and occasionally an amen or two. Next week, my guest, as I've said, is the now very well-known, nationally known scholar, writer, author, Robert P. Jones. He goes by Robbie. He also grew up Southern Baptist in Jackson, Mississippi, educated at Baptist schools in Texas and Mississippi before he got his PhD at Emory University. We're going to be talking to him about all of these, the same thing. What is his perspective on this movement known as Christian nationalism, this effort to capture America and resurrect America or restore America? It's very, very connected to the phrase, make America great again. You can see immediately how that phrase of the Donald Trump campaign picked up a great deal of the emotion and the imagination of this Christian nationalism. It's not an overtly religious phrase, make America great again, but it can be useful in picking up the convictions and the energies of all the people who interpret all of these things in religious categories, right versus wrong, and Christianity versus other religions, or faith versus atheism. And that's been a powerful play. We didn't talk about it today on the show, but perhaps we will get to it next week. I would like to hear from you. You might also want to make a contribution. We now have, I think, we've reached about half of our circle of 70. We're looking for support to keep our program going. And you can go to the support page, meetinghouse.net/support, and read there about how you can become a supporter of this program. We don't raise a lot of money. We don't spend a lot of money. And I don't make any money off of this program. We just try to cover our expenses. That's at the meetinghouse.net support. I want to thank all of you for listening today. We're coming to you over rejoice975.com out of Georgia, Brunswick, Georgia, over 97.5 FM, 94.7 FM, both in Glenn County, Georgia. We're on the SSC Live network of St. Stephen's Baptist Church of Louisville, Kentucky. And we're coming to you on the Meeting House Facebook page and on my personal Facebook page. And if you would share it on your Facebook page, that would be good. I want to thank, as I always do, Everett Armstrong, our engineer in the studio in Brunswick, Georgia, Alex Mattingly, the engineer in our studio in Louisville, Kentucky, and PerfectoCoffeeInc.com of California. Our sponsors of the news every week. I'm going to send Paul a bag of this coffee, as I do all of my guests in the meeting house. We want to thank the Longs out in California, Bruce and Jennifer and their children, for being such loyal listeners and watchers of our program, for producing excellent coffee. and for supporting also what we do. I want to thank Paul again, Paul Djupe of his university in Northern Ohio, Denison University. We're going to do it again with him. All of us, I give you a call to do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with God, drink some coffee, order some Perfecto coffee. Pray for the soul of America. Pray for our leaders. Be kind to someone today. In the Meeting House, I'm Dwight A. Moody. You have a good day.
You have been in the Meeting House with host Dwight A. Moody. Thank you for watching or listening today. Visit our website at themeetinghouse.net for more news, reviews, commentaries, and conversation